Hey guys, welcome back. It's Lucky here, and today we've got a really cool video because I'm in the fairly unique position of having had the opportunity to play both Diablo IV's Vessel of Hatred and Path of Exile 2, both of which have some incredible stuff coming to them this year, right? So no matter how cool you think these two games are about to be, I guarantee you it's even better than that, because the things I've seen and the things I've heard and the things that I've heard that are unconfirmed, they're just amazing for both of these games. So today we're going to be talking about what those things are and why they are so exciting. 2024 has been just a fantastic year for the ARPG genre, right? We've got three dominant ARPGs and they're all kind of taking turns being the most popular ARPG, depending on when their season, their league, or their cycle comes out, right? And so if we look at this chart right here, you can see Diablo 4's launch. It was everything everyone was talking about at the time. And then very quickly, you've got Path of Exile taking the top spot, then Diablo 4, then Last Epoch, then Path of Exile, and then Diablo 4 again, with a massive leap in Season 4, getting huge hype around it. And now here, Path of Exile is coming to take the lead yet again with its next league that's coming up, and it's got a lot of hype around it, right? So it's about to take off. Variety is the spice of life for me, and so I've really been enjoying watching and experiencing Diablo 4 improve and the innovative ideas that Last Epoch has brought to the genre and Path of Exile's continued success. And we're even seeing these games learn from each other. Jonathan Rogers has been working on Path of Exile 2, and when I talked to him, he said, yeah, we're absolutely learning things from these other games that are coming out. There were things that we weren't going to put into Path of Exile 2, and then they put it in their game and it was objectively better. And so it was either implement a worse version of that thing or rise up to the challenge and implement it in Path of Exile 2 as well. And so we're seeing these games evolve at an even faster rate than they used to because they've got that competition, right? Competition is great for the consumer. That's the saying, and it holds true here. These games are just getting better because they're competing with each other. They're also learning from each other. So what we've got coming here is Diablo 4's Vessel of Hatred, which I just had the chance to go and get some hands-on time with. And they're adding a new class, of course. That's the thing that you probably already know. I'm also going to talk about some other stuff that you may not be aware of that they're also going to be adding. So the new class is the SPIRITBORN, and I saw a lot of people comparing it to maybe a druid, but it plays a lot like the monk in that you've got your strike that leaps you into enemies. You've also got a vacuum ability that sucks all the enemies in, and you've got nice kind of quick strikes that have good cleave to them. It very much felt like a flashier version of the monk from D3, which is fine. Diablo 3's monk was a lot of fun to play. I still think it was really interesting that they chose to bring the SPIRITBORN into the game when it would have been a way easier way to just go ahead and slam in an amazing rendition of a paladin, because that's clearly what everybody was excited for, what everybody's hoping for. But they wanted to do something new and something original, and hey, I respect that. And they did a good job from my time. I got to play 4 different versions of a level 30 SPIRITBORN. So it was a good hands-on session with 4 different builds, each one with its own set of legendaries unique slapped onto there. It was a nice way to get a feeling for the early to mid-game version of the class. Now, this doesn't tell us a whole lot about what the end-game version of this class is going to feel like and what the end-game balance of this class is going to feel like, right? Because a level 30 barbarian oftentimes feels nothing like a level 100 barbarian. But, you know, we got to see the skills and we got to feel the skills by themselves before they get ramped up. So it was fun. It was cool. I think they did a really good job on the class. They made it a point to make ultimates much more impactful on this class in that they want people to use ults. There's a lot of classes in Diablo 4 where you just don't use the ult, largely because of the cooldown, right? It's a skill you get to use once every 1 or 2 minutes. And a lot of times you just don't want to have to wait for your power surge to be coming at you in 2-minute incrementals, right? And that's usually what keeps me from having an ultimate that I focus on. It's just that long cooldown. It's kind of contrary to the entire embodiment of what an ARPG is for me. So in this one, you know, it was really nice because one of the versions of the ultimate had a passive attached to it where if you killed something with the ultimate when you used it, there's a 15% chance that it reset the cooldown on the ultimate entirely. So as long as you were attacking large packs of mobs, your ultimate was coming back up off of cooldown instantly when you used it, because it'd kill 10 things. One of those things would proc the reset of the cooldown timer and the timer would be done. So it was a really easy way to just kind of keep the ultimate as a core piece of how this build operates when going from pack to pack. Really liked it. That's the new class. Gorilla version is going to be really tanky, and then you had the bird version, which is going to be really quick, and you can mix and match them, right? My favorite was the centipede, just because of how unique the aesthetic was, and the poison damage felt just different, and it was jumping around from enemy to enemy, which kind of reminded me of an old witch doctor build way back when. But each one of these builds kind of felt different, but all of them felt competent or capable, at least at this level. As you may have heard, the centipede version of this build is definitely far and away the most powerful at level 30 with the items that they gave us. We have no way of knowing what that's going to be like at launch, so I wouldn't put too much into that. And one of the things I could sense about this class that ended up being true, it felt a lot like the rogue in that you weren't constantly battling your resource pile, right? You weren't constantly using a generator so that you could use a spender. It had a good flow to it. The generator felt good to use, and then the spender felt great to use. It kind of had that in common with the rogue. And it turns out that's probably because Bjorn Mikkelsen, the same guy that did a lot of the work on the rogue, also did a lot of the work on the SPIRITBORN. So makes perfect sense. But the thing I want to impress upon you when it comes to talking about Vessel of Hatred is the SPIRITBORN is the tip of the iceberg. It is a very small piece of what is coming with Vessel of Hatred. We are getting things like an entirely new endgame co-op system called the Dark Citadel. This is going to be a co-op endgame activity where you can go in, and is it going to be some kind of a raid, some kind of a dungeon? That part, not sure yet, but it is going to be another new system. So they're continuing to pile on the systems. And one of the things that I've noticed here, if we head over to this sketch here that I made. So in complexity terms, you've got D4 here on the left, you've got Path of Exile on the right, and D4 is ever marching this way, right? It's constantly moving closer to Path of Exile in terms of its complexity, in terms of its depth. Each season, they're adding new things, new systems, new boss fights, right? They are just adding so much every season. And this expansion, Vessel of Hatred, is going to be no different. It's adding an entirely new class. It's adding the Dark Citadel, and it's adding new skills to every class. If I understand correctly, there's going to be new skills. So Sorcerer, Necro, Druid, right? They're all going to be getting new abilities. It's not just going to be reworking their passives. It's not going to be just reworking some of their items. They're getting entirely new abilities with Vessel of Hatred. How freaking awesome is that? Also, Path of Exile 2 is coming into the game, and Path of Exile 2 is kind of trying to move Path of Exile in this direction. It's kind of going towards Diablo 4 in terms of complexity, and while Diablo 4 kind of heads towards it, and they're going to meet somewhere over here, left of Path of Exile, but way right of Diablo 4. It looks like they're going to meet over here in terms of their depth and their complexity. Path of Exile 2 is doing things like removing the need for socket colors and gem colors. And so it's going to be much easier as a new player to just jump into the game. You find these uncut gems, and then you can turn that into any skill you want. You no longer have to find specifically the skill that you want to use, and then find a piece of gear with that socket color, and then the associated socket colors for your support gems that you would normally have to find. So you'd be like, okay, I like this item, but it's not 2 green, 1 red. So what am I going to do with it? I can't use it, right? That's not a thing anymore, right? So Path of Exile is getting much simpler. It's also removing the noob trap of health nodes on the skill tree. So no longer are you going to be able to dive into Path of Exile, pump all your damage nodes and all of the fun looking nodes, and accidentally ignore the health nodes because health is no longer on the skill tree. So it's a noob trap that's just been taken right out of the game, thereby greatly simplifying the skill tree in Path of Exile. It's a lot easier to do it right. And on top of that, Path of Exile is going to allow you to respec much, much easier than they used to. And Path of Exile is also getting that. Path of Exile is letting you use gold to respec in this next season. So they are both trying to make themselves more approachable for new players. Diablo 4 is already the most approachable, and it's trying to now add the depth and the complexity to keep you coming back from season to season. So back to the Diablo 4 expansion, right? We've got a new class, we've got new endgame content inside of this Dark Citadel, we've got potentially a new level cap, or at least a way to get more skill points, because we saw that it looked like the character had 69 skill points. We heard the developers say there's something going on with the Paragon board. I don't know how big or small that change is going to be, but expect changes to the Paragon board system. And of course, tons of uniques and legendaries are being added to the game with this expansion, which are going to further enable completely new builds, completely new skills that may have already been in the game that just haven't been very useful yet, as well as the new skills that haven't been added to the game yet, or that you haven't seen in the game yet, but they will be there with Vessel of Hatred. So Diablo 4 is ramping. This game is getting better and better and better with each season. We saw the season 4 was his best season yet. Here comes season 5. And then after that, we've got the Vessel of Hatred expansion. And I'm really excited to see what else they announce with Vessel of Hatred, because it's looking like they are taking out all the stops. Now, Path of Exile 2. My Path of Exile 2 experience was a little bit different. The way this worked was in Diablo 4, I got to play 4 level 30 characters. It was all the same class, but 4 different builds. In Path of Exile 2, I got to play 1 character that started at level 1, and I got to play it until my time was up. I got a full 6 hours on that character. I played it co-op split screen on a console. So it was very much a learning experience for me because I've never played a ARPG on a console before. I've never used a controller, but I will say that the co-op worked fantastically in Path of Exile 2. Up to this point, Diablo has been the console ARPG. Diablo 3 and 4 were just always built with console in mind in a way that Path of Exile 1 never was. But that's all changing here with Path of Exile 2. They are very much focusing on making sure that this game feels just amazing on console. And my time that I played with it, it did really cool, innovative things like one person can be playing while the other person has their menu open. So you can be choosing your next passive, you can be changing your weapon, and the other person can be playing and it just drags your character along behind them so that they don't have to stop attacking things, stop killing things. And there's just all kinds of really clever little innovative quality of life things that they've added so that just because you're both doing something, it never stops the other person from doing something else. And it cuts down on the downtime. You can all both be in your menus at the same times. You can both be at the merchants at the same time. So Path of Exile 2 is also really looking to innovate in terms of what an ARPG can be on console. So this is really exciting for console players. Now, the other really cool thing about this is probably the first time I've ever seen anything like this. All of that tech that they're implementing into the console version of Path of Exile is coming to the PC version. So you'll be able to play co-op Path of Exile 2 on a PC. You can play on one side of the screen, your friend can play on the other side of the screen. Just, connect the controller to your PC. Boom, he's using the controller, you're playing on the other side, and you've got 2 people co-oping your way through Path of Exile 2 at the same computer. Just really cool because that's something we've never had really as computer players. That's never been an option. Your friend always has to bring their own computer over, or, you don't get that couch co-op experience. Well, now you do. So that's going to be really awesome. When it came to Path of Exile 2 versus D4 Vessel of Hatred is very much when I was running around the new zones, right? I got to experience the new zones inside of the expansion that are being added to the game. And the new zones are very much an extension of what you are familiar with in the game, right? It's not crazy different. The colors, the aesthetics, it's all very new and fresh. That part is going to be real nice. It feels like you're in a new part of the game. It doesn't feel like the other zones in that it's got kind of a new, bolder, artistic style. You could tell that they were really afraid of using too much color in the base game because they wanted to maintain that gritty feel. And then in this expansion, they have dared to find ways to implement a little more color while still retaining that gritty art style that they were trying to hold on to. So D4's Vessel of Hatred, the open world content is going to feel very familiar. You've got the dungeons, you've got the strongholds, and you've got this open world. You run around it on your mount, and it's going to feel very familiar. Path of Exile 2's world is also going to feel kind of familiar, but I would say that it's definitely, being that it is a sequel to Path of Exile, it's an entirely new game, it's going to feel a lot more different and a lot more new than Diablo 4's Vessel of Hatred does. Because Path of Exile 2, like each fight is much more intense. Things are a lot harder to kill. You're much more likely to die. And that's just the trash mobs. Then there's the fact that Path of Exile 2 has over 100 different bosses throughout the game. Every single zone you go in has at least one boss fight in there. And those boss fights are responsible for giving you very substantial loot for that moment in the game. But these boss fights were spectacles. Like some of them were just so insanely cool to see and to look at. A lot of the ones that are deeper into the game that we didn't quite make it to especially look really cool. When I was playing through it, it was just one after another like memorable boss fight. And that's going to be my favorite thing about Path of Exile 2 because my favorite part of ARPGs is definitely the boss encounters. That's where every time you're doing a playthrough, you get to that boss fight acts as a power scaler, right? Like, was it easy this time? Was it hard that time? You know, how strong is my build this playthrough? I killed that boss in 3 hits this time. Usually it takes 20 hits. Cool, I'm doing really good, right? And so having that many bosses to work your way through and to test your power against as you're going, it's just really rewarding. And the boss fights are tough, especially early on. I think as you get stronger and as the power creep begins to happen, as it does in ARPGs, the boss fights will get a lot more manageable. But early on, man, right now, it is very easy to die in those boss fights. And if you do die, you have to start over when you go back in there. The game is built with the intent of you dying on those boss fights. It wants you to die. And so what they do is when you die, you respawn right outside of the boss fight. So you can just walk in and try again. They make dying more inevitable, but they also make it less painful because just a lot less punishment for dying. So they want to normalize dying in Path of Exile 2 a little bit, right? Which is going to be really intense for all the hardcore players out there because it is a game where they fully expect you to die to a boss the first couple of times you fight it. But Path of Exile 2 isn't the only game getting some really cool boss fights. When I was running around the D4 area that I was allowed to run in, I was running into the dungeons. I made it a point to go into the dungeons because I really wanted to see what they were doing for the dungeon boss fights. That's one of the places you can go and you can find a boss in every dungeon, right? And so I got to one of them, and one of the first ones I went to, I was very happy to see that there was a brand new enemy, this tentacular thing. I wouldn't know where to begin to describe it, right? But it was a cool fight. It had cool animations on the enemy. It was new attacks that I've never seen in Diablo 4 before. So the Diablo 4 expansion is definitely going to be adding a lot of new flavor. I think I did see a couple of enemies that I've seen, you know, in base game Diablo 4, but for the most part, it was new enemies, which I know that's big for me. Like I know they've got to recycle some assets here and there, but when I jump into a game's expansion or into a sequel and I start fighting the same mobs I used to fight, it's always a little depressing. Both of these games are doing a fantastic job of giving you new enemies to fight, new experiences to have. Path of Exile 2 did a fantastic job of this. When I was going from one zone to the next, it was not only a completely new biome with completely new look to it, new aesthetic, new art, right? It was completely new enemies. And every time I changed zones, it did that. And I went through multiple different zones. So the enemy diversity in Path of Exile 2 is going to be amazing. And in Diablo 4, you're definitely going to be seeing new enemy types in the Vessel of Hatred expansion as well. Now, when it comes to the difficulty, you've got D4 over here. You've got Path of Exile here. And then, let's see, difficulty. So it looks like this. Difficult. Okay, you've got the difficulty, and the difficulty is getting harder as it goes this way. So you've got D4 here, which is definitely the easiest of the bunch right now. D4 has kind of embraced the everybody should be able to do just about everything philosophy. So the Uber bosses are not terribly Uber. It's very possible for you to achieve everything you want to achieve every season. One of the things I'm curious about is if Diablo 4 is going to start adding aspirational content that is there that they don't expect or that they don't want everybody to expect to complete. Maybe certain boss fights that are incredibly hard, kind of like Lilith used to be. But right now, Diablo 4 is the easiest game. Path of Exile is right here in the middle, and then Path of Exile 2 is going to be the hardest game in terms of just raw difficulty while playing the game. Are you going to die? Path of Exile 2 is all the way over here. It's by far the hardest game. I think it's interesting that Path of Exile 2 is simpler, right? It was left of Path of Exile when it came to complexity, but in terms of difficulty, it's going to be way to the right. Enemies are so much more dangerous, and I'm really curious to see if this is how Path of Exile 2 ends up launching. Now, we only got to play the early levels of Path of Exile 2 because we started at level 1 and we got to play for 6 hours. And we spent a lot of that time kind of exploring and diving into menus and diving into systems. And, we just didn't get that high level in the process. Not only that, we were learning how to play the game on console. And so Path of Exile 2's difficulty is over here. And during my time with it, I found this to be incredibly refreshing. It was really fun to get to a boss room and have to try. Right now in Diablo 4, when you're leveling up, it's pretty face roll. If you do go fight a boss, you can usually stand there toe to toe with them and use any number of your 10 potions that are on your bar and just use those as you need to until the enemy's dead without ever really moving or turning on your brain. That is the early game D4 experience. Path of Exile is not too terribly different. You have to try a little bit harder in the early game and in the leveling process. There's definitely boss fights where you have to move move and you have to dodge attacks. But as you're running through the game, especially if you watch experienced players, you know, they run it to a pack, they 1 or 2 shot it, run to the next pack, 1 or 2 shot it, and barring a huge mistake, they're not going to really die while they're leveling through this story. And then there's Path of Exile 2, where you are going to die. It's better that you just accept that now. You're going to get to a boss fight, and if you don't die to a trash pack before you get to a boss fight, you did better than me and my partner did when we were playing it, right? Even the trash was deadly in this game. So the question I pose to you is, where do you see, with all of that information in mind, where do you see Path of Exile 2 landing on this chart? Right now, Diablo 4 is trading places with Path of Exile, traded places with Last Epoch. Now, Last Epoch certainly didn't have the showing that it did at launch when its first cycle came. Really small bump right there. It didn't nearly grab as many people as a Path of Exile or a Diablo 4 season do or does, but it still did very respectable, right? It's early on. It's in that kind of growing phase where it's still got a lot of systems that it needs to flesh out, a lot of end game that it needs to add. And, you know, very soon, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it seeing the kind of peaks that Path of Exile and Diablo 4 have become accustomed to. What is Path of Exile 2 going to look like in here? You know, it's more approachable in terms of its complexity than Path of Exile 1, but it's far more difficult in terms of just its raw gameplay difficulty than Path of Exile 1 and Diablo 4. And it's going to be a really interesting experiment, you know, especially we've seen there is an appetite for games that make you try. Look at Elden Ring, look at Dark Souls, and any Souls-like, right? Elden Ring is one of the most popular games of all time. And it's going to be really interesting to see how much of an appetite there is for engaging boss fights that make you try just a little bit harder in the ARPG setting, as well as trash packs that are far more deadly and just basically engaging. You're going to have to be attentive and trying a little bit all the time, especially early in the game until your build gets rolling. They say that by the end of the game, you are going to be clearing screenfuls of enemies at a time if that's what you want to do. So it gets to Path of Exile and Diablo levels of speed by the end, it sounds like, but I think that you can expect that the boss fights at the end be a lot harder than the Diablo 4 boss fights are at the end game. Where do you think it's going to be? That's a question I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments. Where do you guys see Path of Exile 2 landing on this chart in terms of its popularity? Do you think it's going to completely replace Path of Exile 1? Do you think it's going to be another peak, you know, in between the Path of Exile and the Diablo seasons? Is it just going to be one more game that we're rotating between? I think that's my guess. I think there's still going to be an audience for Path of Exile 1, especially with the new season. They're buffing everyone. They really seem to be pushing players into really fast-paced game. That's going to be Path of Exile 1. And then Path of Exile 2 is going to kind of be the opposite of that. They're going to try to slow things down, have a lot less screen clutter, a lot more visibility of what's going on, and kind of more impactful decisions. And they're trying, according to Jonathan Rogers, you know, have builds that require you to do more than right click. So it's going to be interesting. Jonathan Rogers said one of the things that he noticed is that, you know, Path of Exile was always a game where people loved the game, but they didn't sometimes love the combat. It felt clunky, you know, whereas Blizzard games, people have always said it has that Blizzard polish, right? That Blizzard detail on the combat, that flow, that smoothness to it, right? And so he said he wants Path of Exile 2 combat to feel better than any other ARPG. And that's why he's trying things like WASD movement, which turned out to feel amazing. And I played the game with a controller, which is just basically an extension of WASD movement. Your left hand is, instead of WASD, you're on the joystick. So I could easily see how WASD is going to feel great with these classes inside of that game. And it's real interesting to think that in the future, moving forward, we are going to be in a timeline where everybody is now WASD moving in their ARPG rather than click to move, which has kind of been a staple in the genre up to this point. And it seems like, it feels like that's about to end. It feels like that's about to change with Path of Exile 2 coming out and kind of revolutionizing the way that it feels to fight and how abilities work with the WASD system. The other thing I noticed about Path of Exile 2 while I was playing it is items are rare, like incredibly rare. Rare items are incredibly rare. Now, this is also partly to do with the fact that I was level 1 when he started. And by the time we finished, I can't recall off the top of my head what level we got up to, at 15, something like that. And so it's the early game, you know, loot. So it's already, probably going to be much more called back. But even in spite of that, I think we would only see a handful of rares in our entire playthrough. And what that meant was that when we did see a rare, we were excited. And it felt really good to be excited about loot when it dropped. Pulling the explosions back that much, you know, in Path of Exile and in Diablo 4, if you kill something, it's going to drop loot. And you kill the next thing, it's going to drop more loot. And you open the chest, loot explosion, right? And you kill the boss and loot explosion. And oh, it's a legendary, put it on. Oh, there's a green number on it, put it on. And you don't really get super excited about them while you're leveling. And I did appreciate that in Path of Exile 2, the scarcity of items that you got combined with the difficulty of the content made getting upgrades really satisfying, and it felt really good. One of the things that I'm not sure is going to go over super well in Path of Exile 2 is going to be the collision system with enemies and allies. It's very easy to get yourself boxed in either by enemies or by allies. I accidentally killed my partner once, and I'm pretty sure he accidentally killed me once, you know, standing behind me when I had enemies in front of me, and I couldn't get back out because, you know, he's blocking my path. That's going to be an interesting one. Jonathan Rogers says that he wants everything to have weight to it. He wants things to feel present in the world. And part of that includes making sure that you have collision with everything. Bigger enemies are going to have more collision in that you're not going to be able to move them. Whereas the smaller enemies, if you use an ability, you're going to be able to kind of push them out of the way and get through them, right? So each enemy is going to kind of have its own weight to it. It determines how hard it is or how possible it is to kind of push your way past it or through it. Now, what Path of Exile 1 just added was a really interesting system. And right now, they're only letting you trade currency. So you can exchange currency. If you have this currency, but you need this currency, you can do swaps for currency, not items yet. What's really interesting about the way they're handling this is it could solve the problem that I had with the auction house in Diablo 3. So in Diablo 3, the problem I had with the auction house was it was the fastest way to get good gear. Playing the game was actually wasting time. So if you were out killing enemies, you were wasting time. By far, the fastest way to get a better item was to flip items on the auction house. And it wasn't even close. And I think Path of Exile 1 suffers from this a little bit in the trade league, where the experienced traders know that, you know, the fastest way to get rich is just to flip items on the auction house, which to me is antithetical to the entire experience of an ARPG of like going out, killing enemies, and that being the best way to get your upgrades, right? So what the gold system does, where you need to use some gold to make a trade, is it limits the number of trades you can do in a day, because the only way you get gold is by playing. So you're going to get X amount of gold per hour, and then you can use that gold to either respec your character or make trades on the auction house. What this also does that's really important is a big problem with the auction house system is bots. Bots just sit there, right? And they're the ones flipping all day long. And they're the ones manipulating the auction house by flipping all day long. But if the bots can't do that because they're limited by the amount of gold they have and the number of trades, right? They can't just be sitting there flipping all day if they need to be playing the game to earn gold, and the amount of gold they can earn is limited. So they're limited to X number of trades per day, right? This significantly hinders the impact that bots could have on the market. So the whole system is really interesting to me. That sounds really cool. And it solves the problem of just me seeing that the game has an auction house built into it and then being like, well, why am I out running maps? I could just sit here and fish for items in the auction house until I find the upgrade that I want because someone listed it for cheap. Or maybe I see something listed for cheap and I'm just going to flip it, right? And you end up playing an auction house simulator instead of ARPG. So I'm really curious to see if they ever extend this currency exchange into something more than that. That's pretty cool. As far as things that I think people might not like about Diablo 4's Vessel of Hatred or Path of Exile 2 goes, one of the things in Path of Exile 2 that I think may not go over super well is when you die, the zone resets and all the enemies respawn, which in itself, that part's not too painful, right? That's okay because it does have checkpoints. So if you're halfway through the zone and you die, it throws you to that checkpoint halfway through the zone, and then you continue from there. And so you don't lose all your progress. And if you died, you probably need to kill more mobs to get more levels and more loot anyway, right? So it's kind of helping you have things to kill, because if you just fall eternally behind in terms of your levels and your gear, I mean, that's not gonna be great either, right? So the mobs respawning is okay. But the other thing that happens when you die is all the loot that's on the ground disappears when the map resets. So the mobs respawn and all the loot you had on the ground is gone. And there was times where we were fighting a boss and we die, right? And there was some loot on the ground and we didn't get a chance to pick it up. And so you can kind of counter this by making sure that you loot everything as you're playing the game and making sure like something drops on the ground. It adds this anxiety though, because now anytime something's on the ground, you kind of feel like, oh man, I have to run over and pick it up, which can kind of really mess with the flow of an ARPG. You know, normally you clear the room, you kill all the enemies, and then you go pick up the item. Now you're trying to like throw out your spells, move your way over to that item that's on the ground, and then click on it while also attacking the enemies. And so this is probably the main thing that I think may get some flack, aside from just the general difficulty of it, which I know that's always something that love or hate. Some people love a challenge. I'm one of those people. Some people don't. And no matter how hard something is, they're always going to complain. It's too hard. But one that's a little more up for debate is going to be, you know, items disappearing when you die. And the first time you have something like a divine orb on the ground and you die, or something really valuable, right? It's really going to hurt. And I think it could create a little bit of animosity from the player towards that system. As far as something goes that people might not like in Diablo 4's Vessel of Hatred, this one's a little bit harder for me to explain, because if you like Diablo 4 now, I think you're going to like Diablo 4 Vessel of Hatred, because it's very much an expansion. So it's an extension of what you're currently doing. If you like strongholds, you're going to like the strongholds. If you like the dungeons in Diablo, you're going to like going into the dungeons in Diablo 4, Vessel of Hatred, right? So it's an extension of what you have been doing. So I guess if there's anything that someone might not like about Vessel of Hatred, it'll be that the open world in Vessel of Hatred feels very familiar. It's more of the same. But I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just very, those zones we had strongholds, in this zone we have stronghold. In those zones we had dungeons, this zone we have dungeons. It's a new zone, but it feels a lot like the old zones. One thing that I never loved in Diablo 4 was that status effects don't impart those status effects on the enemy. So for instance, you don't chill bosses when you're fighting bosses. If you have chill, you just fill up their stagger bar. If you have shock, if you have whatever, like you're just filling up the stagger bar rather than imparting that actual effect. And in Path of Exile 2, they have both, and I friggin' love it. So you've got the stagger bar on the bosses, but also if you hit the boss with enough cold attacks, you will freeze the boss. I don't know why Diablo didn't do this, and I kind of hope someday that changes, because it makes status effect builds like frost builds, it makes them feel a lot more homogenized, right? When you're fighting the boss, you're all filling up the same meter, whether it's slow, whether it's chill, whether it's whatever, it's all moving that same meter, and it can make all the builds feel a lot more samey in the boss fights. Whereas in Path of Exile 2, I did like that if you had a cold spell, you would see the cold counting up from 0% to 100%. Every time you use the spell, that cold meter would go up, 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 up until the boss actually froze. So I absolutely love that they found a way to kind of implement that into the boss fights. Would love Diablo to do something like that, to kind of step back from the homogenization that comes with just having one meter for all status effects. That would be cool. And just to wrap this thing up, like I said, I think both of these games are doing incredibly well right now. I think Diablo 4 is on the right track. I think Vessel of Hatred is going to be amazing, not because of the things that we know about, but because of the things that they haven't announced yet. Those are the ones I'm really excited. The new class is awesome, and I think that people are going to love it. It's going to become another fan favorite, especially if you liked the monk gameplay from previous Diablo 3, but also because of the things that they haven't announced yet. It's going to be one of those moments similar to the recent Path of Exile launch for their new league that they just announced, and everybody's flipping out because of how amazing the changes that are coming are, and just how many of them there are. Diablo 4 is going to have one of those moments with Vessel of Hatred. I promise you that. It's coming, so get ready for that. That's going to be exciting. And then as far as Path of Exile 2 goes, it's going to be a leap forward for the genre. It really does feel like they are trying to innovate. They are trying to implement the best version of every system they can, whether it's something someone else is already doing or something that has never been attempted before in ARPGs. They're trying to take ARPGs to the next level, really experimenting with what an ARPG could be. They are kind of positioning it. It's Path of Exile, but it is also nothing like Path of Exile. So I'm really excited for the rest of this year. We've got the Path of Exile 2 beta coming out later this year. Date is still unannounced. And we've got Diablo 4 Vessel of Hatred coming out on October 8th. And that's not including Season 5 of Diablo 4 or the new league in Path of Exile or everything that's going on inside of Last Epoch, right? So it's going to be a good year, man, to be a ARPG player. So thank you guys so much for listening. Massive shout out to my YouTube channel members. If you want to become a YouTube channel member for behind the scenes footage, access to a private Discord channel where you can ask me anything you want, click the join button down below or click the link in the description. If you're not sure what to do next, maybe check out one of these other videos popping up on screen right now.